The moment his hand clamped around my wrist and twisted my elbow downward, the entire hallway outside the auditorium froze. His grip was rough enough to jolt a nerve, but he acted like it was some noble act of instruction. "You call that a salute?" He growled loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. "Do not embarrass this family. Riley." The words hit harder than the pressure on my arm. Master Sergeant Dale Hargrove stood so close I could smell the aftershave he used for every ceremony, the kind he thought made him look like the ideal soldier. His uniform was covered in patches, his chest puffed out with old pride, and his voice carried that familiar tone of authority he loved to use on me ever since I was a teenager. "Intel Princess thinks she's a real soldier now," he said louder, turning his head so 2 young officers nearby could hear it clearly. "Keep your mouth shut in there. Real Army is talking." The officers looked away awkwardly, pretending they had not heard him, but their eyes flickered with confusion. A grown man correcting a full-grown woman's salute in public, and not gently either. He tightened his hand again as if the strength of his grip validated the strength of his rank. I said nothing. I could have corrected him. I could have reminded him who signs the orders now. Instead, I just swallowed the old, familiar taste of metal and dust. Silence. A young lieutenant walking past slowed when he caught my nameplate. Kincaid. His brows rose almost comically. "Mom, are you—" I kept my gaze forward. "Not today, Lieutenant. Let it go." He hesitated, nodded stiffly, and moved on. That was the first small twist, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. I was not weak. I was not inexperienced. I was not someone who needed a man like Dale to adjust my salute as if I had just arrived at basic, but I had a secret he knew nothing about. And I was about to walk into the one room on this base where his opinion of me no longer mattered. Dale leaned toward my mother Laura with exaggerated confidence. "Make sure she sits with you. She needs to watch and learn from the real leaders today." She gave me a small, apologetic smile, the kind she had practiced for years, the kind that said, "I cannot stop him. Riley, please don't make this worse." I went along with it. I walked to the back row exactly where he told me to sit. His voice followed me like a shadow. "Good. Stay back there. This is for actual leadership." The irony would have been funny if it had not been so familiar. The auditorium was filling quickly. Flags lined the stage. Camera crews moved between rows. Family members chatted loudly, proud and excited. The change of command and award ceremony for the 305th Intelligence Battalion was a major event. Soldiers in dress blues boots polished like mirrors sat tall and silent in the front rows. Meanwhile, I sat behind a column, my stepfather satisfied that he had once again put me in my place. Then the music quieted, and the announcer called for attention. A 3-star general walked to the podium, his presence instantly pulling the room into focus. Today we honor a soldier whose work has saved more lives than most of us will ever know he began. Someone who has shaped the modern battlefield with intelligence, precision, and courage. Dale leaned back smugly. "Bet it's some special ops guy," he whispered to a man beside him. "Probably someone who never hid behind a computer." The general continued. "The youngest officer to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for cyber intelligence operations in the last decade." A ripple moved across the room. Heads turned. A few soldiers whispered. Dale muttered, "Something like that never goes to intel people anyway." He stretched his neck casually like he was about to watch a football game. Then came the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for Lieutenant Colonel Riley Kincaid, commander of the 305th Intelligence Battalion." The entire room rose instantly. Hundreds of people turned toward the back. Cameras swung. Officers snapped to attention. Every soldier in the building acknowledged my presence before they even saw me. And Dale twisted in his seat, his face draining color as he watched me stand. I stepped into the aisle slowly, boots steady, shoulders level. The general descended from the stage to greet me himself. "Welcome, Mom," he said firmly. The word "Mom" echoed through the room as officers rendered a sharp salute meant for me and only me. The camera above captured everything. Dale still seated stunned, then scrambling to his feet too late, too awkwardly too small, in a room that suddenly knew exactly who I was. For the first time in my life, I did not have to defend myself. I simply walked down the aisle and the army corrected him for me. He spent years correcting my salute. This time I let the army correct him. I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina between 2004 and 2009, and for most people, our street looked like the picture of quiet suburban life, with trimmed lawns and kids riding their bikes and the hum of Saturday football games coming from open garages. But inside our house, the air always felt tighter and heavier because Dale Hargrove carried the atmosphere of deployment home with him like a second skin. He walked through the front door with the same intensity he carried in uniform, and even when he was in jeans and a faded tee, he spoke in the clipped, controlled tone of a master sergeant addressing a formation. So when I was 13 and he told me to stand up when he walked into the room, I obeyed before I understood why the command came sharp and sudden. And my mother, Laura, winced a little, but said nothing because she wanted peace. And peace meant not challenging the man who believed authority was something you projected through volume and posture rather than care or patience. He expected eye contact locked in place and silence whenever he spoke. And if my voice shook or my gaze drifted, even for a second, he would snap eyes forward like I was a private fumbling through my first day at basic. And I remember feeling a strange blend of fear and shame, because none of my friends had to greet their stepfathers like superior officers. And yet I convinced myself that maybe this was tough love. Maybe this was how soldiers were made, even though I was not a soldier, not yet just a girl trying to disappear into the wallpaper whenever he stomped through the hallway. And whenever something went wrong in school, whenever I brought home a low test score or a note from a teacher, he treated it like a disciplinary failure. And once after I failed a math quiz, he marched me into the living room, pointed to the spot in front of the television where a football game flickered in bright colors, and ordered me to stand at attention until he said otherwise, and I stood there stiff and trembling for what felt like forever, my legs aching while he lectured about weakness and discipline, and how if I could not even pass math, I would never pass basic. And he said it not as encouragement, but as judgment, as a final stamp on who he thought I would become. My mother tried to object, saying she was worried I would faint. But he cut her off with a colder tone than I had ever heard and said, "This is how you build a soldier." And she backed down terrified of turning the moment into a larger storm. And I understood then that she lived in a smaller, quieter fear than mine. A fear of losing the fragile stability they had created after years of hardship. And I hated myself a little for adding to her tension. But I hated him more for crushing both of us under the weight of what he called discipline. And the older I got, the worse it became, because Dale measured my worth by how closely I matched his idea of toughness. And whenever I cried or questioned or hesitated, he told me to stop crying, because crying was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable in his house. And I learned to swallow my emotions the same way I swallowed stale air in that living room while the TV cast flickering shadows across my face. One night, around the time I turned 14, I passed by his room on the way to the kitchen and heard him laughing on the phone with one of his old Ranger buddies, bragging about how my softness would never survive the real world, and how I would never wear a uniform like them, and how at best I would work mall security if someone felt generous enough to hire me, and the laughter in his voice cut deeper than anything he had ever said to my face. Because for the first time, I understood he was not trying to shape me into anything strong. He simply believed I had no strength to begin with, and that belief gave him permission in his own mind to talk to me, like I was already a disappointment. I pressed my hand against the wall that night and struggled to breathe quietly, because I did not want him to hear that he had gotten to me, even though he had gotten to me every day since he married my mother. And something shifted in me Then something silent and fierce, I realized that if being a soldier meant being him, then I did not want that life. But at the same time, a different kind of fire lit inside me, one that whispered that maybe there was another version of service, another version of strength that existed beyond his narrow view, and I wanted that version. So I began researching Army ROTC programs on my school computer long after everyone had gone to sleep, reading about commissioning and intelligence work and scholarships, and the possibility of a life built on discipline that did not require cruelty. And I promised myself I would never tell Dale about those late-night searches, because the dream felt too fragile to expose to someone who used dreams as weapons. And so at 15, I filled out my ROTC interest form, secretly saving it under a folder labeled homework. And I carried that quiet hope like a shield every time he barked a command or corrected my posture or called me soft, because for the first time I had a path that belonged to me and not to his idea of who I should be. And even though the years between 13 and 18 were filled with countless small humiliations and constant correction, I learned to endure by imagining another life far away from Wilmington, where his voice did not define me and his rank did not hover over every decision. And whenever the weight felt unbearable, I pictured myself older, stronger, distant, walking through a place where my steps no longer echoed with fear, and I realized later that imagining that future was the first true act of defiance I ever made against him, a small silent act, but enough to keep me moving until the day I finally stepped into the world he swore I would never survive. Leaving Wilmington for UNC Charlotte in the fall of 2010 felt like stepping into air that finally belonged to me. The campus was loud and alive with students moving between brick buildings and grassy quads, and for the first time in my life, I could walk without the constant awareness of someone judging the angle of my elbows or the way my shoulders carried my weight. The freedom made me dizzy at first, and I kept catching myself listening for Dale's voice, even though he was hours away. But beneath that leftover tension, something new began to grow. A quiet determination that had been forming in secret ever since the night I heard him say I would never wear a uniform like him. And standing in the ROTC office for the first time, I felt that determination sharpen into resolve when I saw the posters on the walls showing commissioned officers leading troops and the mission statements about honor and service that felt nothing like the rigid cruelty I grew up with. Signing my name onto the ROTC enrollment form was the first moment I did something entirely for myself, and even though my hands trembled, I felt a spark of hope, as if I had opened a door into a different future, a future that did not include Dale's voice defining my worth. And when I called home to tell him I had joined the Army ROTC program, his reaction came exactly as I had expected, because the moment he heard the word intelligence, he laughed a sharp, mean laugh that cut right through the phone and said, "So you will be the girl behind the screens," and then followed it with real soldier's bleed. Riley, as if my choice had already proved him right about my weakness. My mother tried to soften the conversation in the background, but he talked over both of us and ended the call before I could explain that military intelligence was not a backup choice or an escape from hardship, but a deliberate step toward a world where the strongest minds serve just as critically as the strongest bodies. And his contempt only fueled my motivation, because it reminded me that I was not doing this for him or for his approval. I was doing this to build a life he would never control. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into physical training drills and academic courses that challenged every part of me in ways that felt demanding but fair. And in the midst of all that pressure, I met Captain Jordan Ellis, the ROTC instructor, who became the first mentor in my life, who understood what leadership looked like without intimidation. The first day he corrected my posture, he did not grab my wrist or raise his voice. He just stepped back, squinted slightly, and asked, "Who taught you to stand like a statue?" And when I told him quietly my stepdad, he is Army, He gave a thoughtful nod and said he taught you half of it. I will teach you the rest, not to fear rank. And something uncoiled inside me because those words separated the Army from the man who used its culture to justify his behavior. Captain Ellis pushed me hard, but with intention he taught me how to command, not through fear, but through clarity and competence. And he often said, leadership starts with knowing where your fear comes from, so you can stop carrying it like a burden you never asked for. And through long runs across campus fields and hours spent planning mock operations, I began to strip away the false lessons Dale had drilled into me and replace them with principles grounded in respect and accountability, not dominance. I chose the military intelligence track with purpose, drawn to the idea of shaping outcomes without being the loudest voice in the room. And as I absorbed classes on signals, analysis, foreign threat assessments, and strategic planning, I felt myself stepping further into the version of service I had imagined as a teenager. A version defined not by force, but by precision and insight. The years passed quickly, marked by early morning formations, late-night study sessions, and long weekends spent on field exercises that tested both body and mind. And with each challenge, I shed more of the fear that had shaped my childhood, replacing it with capability that belonged entirely to me. Sometimes Dale called during holidays and breaks, and every conversation followed the same pattern. He would ask if I had changed my mind about intel and suggest I was wasting my time training for a job that did not require real courage. And whenever he made those comments, I would glance out the window at the campus drill field or the scattered notebooks filled with mission plans and feel a calm certainty that he no longer understood anything about who I was becoming. The Army was no longer a shadow cast over me. It was a path I was choosing on my own terms. In the spring of 2014, I approached commissioning day with a strange mix of anticipation and grief. Anticipation for the life I was about to enter, and grief for the girl who had once believed she had to earn love. Through obedience, the ceremony took place on a sunny afternoon with rows of chairs lined up beneath the flagpole and the ROTC cadre standing tall behind the podium. And when I stepped forward, raised my right hand and repeated the oath of office, I felt something inside finally break free. Captain Ellis smiled with genuine pride as he saluted me, and my classmates cheered softly. But when the crowd shifted and families clapped, I realized there was one person who was not there. Despite being invited, Dale had stayed home claiming a scheduling conflict, and instead he sent a text that arrived minutes after I received my first salute from a junior cadet. The message read simply, "Do not quit halfway," and for the first time his absence felt like clarity. Not rejection, because I understood that this part of my life, the part built on my own choices and my own strength, did not belong to him and never would again. I walked off that parade field as a second lieutenant, carrying both the weight of my past and the promise of a future where no one would shape me through fear. And for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that the uniform I wore was mine. Arriving at Fort Meade in 2016 felt like stepping into the center of a world no one in my family had ever seen, a place where intelligence work did not hide in shadows, but pulsed at the heart of every operation. And as a young first lieutenant, still learning how to carry authority in my voice, I found myself surrounded by screens, data streams, and analysts who could shift the direction of entire missions with a single decision. Yet even in that high-pressure environment, I felt something close to belonging for the first time, because here my mind mattered more than how straight I stood in a living room or how quickly I snapped to attention. When someone walked through the door and under the guidance of Major Aiden Park, I began to understand what strategic impact meant as he pushed me to think faster, dig deeper, and trust my instincts even when senior officers hesitated. The memory of Dale dismissing my intelligence training as a job behind the screens still echoed in my mind, But here, those screens carried lives, and one night during a winter shift, I saw exactly what he never understood when a sudden spike in foreign traffic flashed across our monitors, and within moments, our team realized a coordinated cyber attack was targeting a NATO base with the potential to collapse their communication infrastructure and leave entire units blind. The room tightened with tension, but Major Park's voice cut through clearly as he told me to take lead on the counterplan, and I felt my pulse race. Not with fear, but with certainty, because the patterns on the screen made sense in a way that felt instinctive. And as I issued instructions to reroute signals, deploy countermeasures, and isolate the intruding code, I heard the room quiet until all that remained was the rapid clicking of keys and Park's steady breathing beside me. When the attack finally broke apart in a cascade of failed scripts and misfired commands, the room exhaled as one, and Park turned toward me with a look that said he had trusted me, not because I was the youngest or the fastest, but because I saw the battlefield differently. A battlefield of information, not bullets, and that night no one was hurt. No alarms sounded on the ground. No soldiers had to scramble for cover. The operation ended without a single casualty, because we stopped the threat before anyone outside that room even knew there was danger. The report moved quickly through command channels, and weeks later, I found myself standing at attention as a general pinned a bronze star onto my uniform. The flash of cameras bathing the stage in light, and Major Park nodded with quiet pride from the side. But the real shock came months later when a second ceremony was announced, and I was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for my role in preventing what could have been an international disaster. I felt the weight of the medal settle on my chest, heavy not because of its physical form, but because of what it represented: recognition that was almost unheard of for military intelligence officers my age. And as reporters and soldiers approached me afterward, whispering the surname Kincaid with a kind of reverent curiosity, I thought about how surreal it all felt compared to the girl who once stood trembling in a living room while Dale barked orders at her. When the article about my awards hit the Army Times, my mother called breathless with pride. But when Dale got on the phone, the first words out of his mouth were, "Medals are easy when you never leave the chair." And he said it as if the lives protected that night were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. As if my achievement somehow threatened the authority he clung to like armor. I tried to ignore his tone. But later, my mother told me quietly that one of his old Ranger buddies had looked at him and said, "You do realize she outranks half the guys you brag about, right?" And I imagine the silence that must have followed that stunned pause, where arrogance collides with reality. Yet even then, he refused to acknowledge it. And at home, he kept acting as if nothing I did mattered at the dinner table. My name floated in and out of conversation, but he always redirected attention to stories of his own deployments, as if drowning out the fact that my rank now exceeded his. By several grades, still inside me, there was a flicker of pride that had nothing to do with his approval and everything to do with standing in that ceremony hall at Fort Meade flashbulbs, exploding like tiny stars, while a general fastened the medal onto my uniform. A moment cross-cut in my memory with Dale sitting on his recliner miles away, turning off the TV and muttering "overrated," because that was easier for him than admitting the girl he tried to break had surpassed every expectation he ever set for her. And as I walked back to my office that day, the weight of the medals grounding me, I thought they call me a hero out there. But at home, I am still the girl who stands wrong. Yet for the first time, that thought did not sting. It only made me more certain that my life was moving far beyond the reach of the man who once defined it. Thanksgiving of 2022 pulled me back to Wilmington the way it always did. Cool river air outside and the smell of turkey and stuffing heavy in my mother's kitchen, though I was a major by then with years at Fort Meade behind me. The minute I stepped over the threshold, I felt my shoulders rise a fraction, the old instinct to brace before Dale walked into any room I occupied. Laura had stretched the dining table to its full length, polished her good plates, folded cloth napkins. She wanted this one night to look like every picture of an American holiday cousins. Mark and Tessa set pies on the counter. Uncle Ron opened a beer and claimed the end chair. Everyone hugged me, asked what life near Washington was like, then turned away before I could give more than a sentence. It was noisy until the front door opened again and Dale came in. Wearing jeans and a polo with his unit emblem on the chest, shoulders squared, as if he were entering a briefing. He clapped Ron on the back, kissed my mother's cheek, gave me a nod that said both, "I see you and I will not acknowledge what you have done," then dropped into his chair like a man assuming his place. We took our seats, hands briefly linked, while my mother mumbled a blessing for a few minutes. Conversation stayed light, football and weather and whose kids were doing what. Then Mark looked down the table at me with a grin and said, "So I heard you were kind of famous now, something about an article, some medal." There was curiosity in his voice. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could form a sentence, Dale let out a laugh and said, "Paper hero, pushes buttons, gets medals, ask her how many times she has actually been shot at." His voice cut clean through the chatter. The table went quiet enough for everyone to hear. My mother reached for the mashed potatoes as if they required urgent attention. Uncle Ron gave a weak chuckle. Mark lowered his eyes. I held my fork tighter and reminded myself of the lives that never made the news because of the work my team did, then said evenly that my job was to make sure fewer people needed to be shot at. Dale shook his head and muttered that the Army had gone soft and slid into one of his stories about dust and heat and real fighting. The older relatives leaned toward him, drawn by volume and swagger, and I felt again that split between the way my name echoed in certain halls on base and the way it dissolved at this table. As the meal went on, he kept looping me into his stories as a contrast. Every time someone tried to ask me a question, he found a way to answer for me. At one point, a younger cousin edged up behind my chair, phone in hand, and whispered that he had seen my picture in a military timepiece. And could we take a selfie? I smiled and said, sure. But before he could raise the phone, Dale called across the table, "Do not feed her ego, kid. You will hear about DC medals all night if you start that." The boy flinched, mumbled, "Sorry, Mom," and backed away, sliding the phone into his pocket like he had done something wrong. The look in his eyes made something go still inside me. Not new hurt, I had run out of that years ago, but a recognition that no set of achievements would ever rewrite the story Dale preferred to tell about me. After dinner, people drifted toward the living room and the noise of the game. I stayed in the kitchen stacking plates, letting warm water and small tasks settle my breathing. Ron's son hovered in the doorway, then stepped in. He said, "Aunt Riley, I'm thinking about joining the Army when I graduate. Mom says I should talk to you, not him." And he tilted his head toward the other room where Dale's laugh carried over the commentary. I heard the question he did not quite say, "Is there a way to serve without turning into that?" So I dried my hands and asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to get out of town to do something that mattered, but he did not want to come back angry. I thought about the quiet complaints I had heard about Dale's unit, the way younger soldiers described a culture more interested in proving toughness than building skill, and I knew I could not choose this boy's path, but I could help him avoid the worst of that. I pulled out my phone, gave him the name and number of a recruiter I trusted, told him to ask questions about unit culture to look for leaders who corrected without humiliating, then added softly that there were commands he should steer clear of places where men needed to stand on others to feel tall. His gaze flicked toward the living room again, and he nodded, folding the number into his wallet like a shield. When we walked back toward the hall, I saw Dale by the fridge, belly pressing against his belt, beer in hand, telling Uncle Ron how he had straightened out some private who thought he was special. His voice booming, his gestures big, the familiar performance of a man who only knew one way to feel important. And I realized as I watched him that I no longer needed anything from him. He wanted to be the only soldier in the room. the only story that mattered, fine. He could keep his little kingdom of loud opinions and shrinking listeners, because beyond that house, my work spoke in quieter rooms he would never enter, and the respect I carried there could not be touched by his refusal to see me. When I transferred to Fort Liberty at the start of 2024, the air felt different from every other post I had known, heavier with history and alive with a sense of movement. By then I was a major with more years in the Army than I sometimes remembered, and a record that followed me whenever I signed into a new command. But I still walked into the headquarters building for the first time with that small coil of doubt low in my stomach, the leftover echo of every time Dale had implied I was playing soldier instead of living it. The battalion I joined was already busy, operations boards crowded with tasks, analysts bent over screens, briefings sliding into one another, and I focused on the work because the work was the one place his voice did not reach. Then one afternoon, I was called to report to Brigadier General Harper Shaw in a quiet office on the second floor, the kind of space that looked plain until you noticed the framed citations on the wall and the secure phone on the desk. Shaw was a woman who carried calm like a weapon. She motioned for me to sit and spend a few minutes asking about my team and my view of how the mission was evolving. And as we talked, I realized she was not testing my memory. She was weighing my judgment. Finally, she leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "You know why I asked you here today?" I shook my head, even though a part of me suspected she watched me for a moment, then said, "You are our pick for the 305th Intelligence Battalion Commander. It is early for your age, but your record speaks loudly." And I felt my mind stutter over the words, commander, not staff, not deputy. The actual position that men like Dale would talk about with reverence over beers for a second. My throat closed. I managed to ask if she was sure the timing made sense. She smiled slightly and said, "If you were not ready, I would not be offering. This is not a favor. This is the next logical step in your service. The promotion list was already approved." She added, "You will pin Lieutenant Colonel and assume command at the ceremony. This fall, the formal orders will arrive next week. But as far as I am concerned, this is decided." The room felt smaller and larger, at the same time smaller, because the responsibility wrapped itself around my shoulders like a physical weight. Larger because my life suddenly stretched out in directions Dale had never believed I could touch. News traveled fast on post. Within days, people I barely knew were stopping me in the hallway calling me Mom with a new kind of emphasis. Younger soldiers whispered that my work at Fort Meade had saved their friends. Older officers clapped me on the shoulder and said things like, "About time someone promoted her in the evenings when the building quieted." I would sit alone in my office staring at the battalion flag hanging in the corner, knowing soon it would be mine to carry. It should have been the moment I called home with uncomplicated joy. But nothing involving my family had ever been uncomplicated. When I told my mother, Laura, over the phone that I was being promoted and taking command, she gasped the way she used to when a patient turned a corner at the hospital. Pride and relief tangled together. She said, "Your grandmother would have been so proud." I heard dishes clink in the background. Then she lowered her voice and said, "Dale is already talking about wearing his dress uniform to your ceremony. He says he wants to show you how it is done." The words tasted sour. Even secondhand, I could see it perfectly. Him straightening his ribbons in the mirror, rehearsing stories about his own time and turning my day into yet another stage for his performance. I told her gently that the ceremony was about the unit, not about him. She laughed nervously and said, "You know how he is. He just wants to be part of it." I stared out the window at the motor pool, thinking he had been part of everything for decades, even when I did not want him there. This time I would choose who had the spotlight. A week before the event, General Shaw called me back into her office to go over the program. She slid a draft across the desk detailing the sequence colors posted: outgoing commander remarks, incoming commander remarks reception. Her finger tapped one line that read, "Arrival of commander," and she said, "When you walk into that room, they will stand for you, all of them." Then she added more quietly, "Some people who never stood for you in your life will have to, and for a heartbeat. My breath caught because she could not have known the full history, but she understood enough rank carried certain rituals with it, not just respect, but obligation. The kind a man like Dale believed belonged only to him. I pictured him sitting in a row of chairs, polishing the toe of his shoe with one foot ready to critique how I walked. Then the announcer calling my name, and the entire hall rising before he had time to process it. The thought did not make me gloat, but it settled something old and raw inside me. He had taught me to fear rank to brace whenever someone above me entered a room. Now rank would teach him who I had become. This promotion was not a fluke or a mistake or a bit of luck snatched out of his hands. It was the natural conclusion of every long night, every quiet decision to keep going, when his voice told me to stop as the date of the ceremony drew closer. I tried on my Class A uniform in the mirror of my barracks room, fingers brushing over the silver oak leaves that would soon sit on my shoulders. I studied my reflection. Not as a girl trying to meet someone else's standard, but as a commander about to take responsibility for hundreds of lives. And for the first time, instead of hearing Dale's criticism in my head, I heard my own voice, steady, clear, saying, "This is yours. Walk into that room like you belong there because you do." The morning of the ceremony felt strangely quiet for a day that would divide my life cleanly into a before and an after. And as I walked toward the large brick hall at Fort Liberty, in my fully pressed Class A uniform medals, catching the early light, I could feel the familiar tightness forming in my chest, a leftover reflex from every childhood moment I had stood too close to Dale. But I kept my pace steady, because today was about command, not fear. The air buzzing with the low hum of soldiers milling around the entrance, young lieutenants adjusting collars, senior NCOs guiding families toward the doors, and for a brief moment I almost allowed myself to believe that this day would pass without incident. But then I heard his voice behind me, sharp and dismissive the way it had always been. Riley, hold up, and before I could turn fully, he was already in front of me, eyes scanning my uniform with open disapproval, not offering a salute, not even acknowledging the insignia on my chest. Instead, he clicked his tongue and said, "Your hand is too stiff. Elbow is wrong. God, Kincaid, you are going to embarrass the entire uniform if you walk in like that." His words loud enough for two nearby privates to glance over nervously, and before I could step back, he grabbed my wrist fingers digging into my skin, twisting my forearm upward as if I were still 14 and trembling under his corrections. He forced my elbow into a rigid angle and muttered that even cadets knew better than this. I kept my face still, not because I agreed with him, but because reacting would give him the scene he craved. So I stood there and let his hand clamp around my wrist, feeling the pressure, pulse against the place where my pulse beat slow and steady, and from the corner of my eye I saw Captain Ortiz walking toward us, his stride slowing as he recognized the insignia, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Cyber Warfare pin, the command patch that even experienced officers seldom wore. His eyes widened, then flicked between me and Dale with disbelief, his mouth opening slightly as if he were about to intervene. But I gave the smallest shake of my head, a quiet signal that this moment was mine to handle. Not as Ortiz, hesitated, then kept walking, though he kept glancing back as if waiting for me to give another signal. Laura stood a few feet behind Dale, wringing her hands, her voice soft and apologetic as she said, "He is just nervous, Riley. You know how he gets before big events." I did not look at her because if I did, I might have said something that would echo for the rest of her life. Instead, I told my voice to stay steady and said, "I am fine," but my wrist burned from the grip, and my uniform sleeve was still creased where he had twisted it. A physical reminder of the contrast between the world he lived in and the world I served. Then, as if the universe wanted to underline that contrast, a young officer carrying a clipboard approached and asked politely, "Mom, do you want your family in the VIP front row?" There was expectation in his tone, as if the correct answer was obvious because this was the moment families usually took their proudest seats, but all I felt was the echo of Dale's hand still wrapped around my wrist a minute earlier, so I looked at the officer and said no. Back row, please. And under the balcony camera seat, Master Sergeant Hargrove there. His eyebrows lifted slightly at the specificity, but he nodded without question, and noted the assignment on his chart. He did not ask why, and I offered no explanation because the answer was already forming in my mind, like a quiet tide pulling at the edges of my composure. The ceremony would be recorded from every angle. The official archive capturing the shift in command for the 305th Intelligence Battalion, and when the entire hall rose for the incoming commander, the balcony camera would sweep the back row first before turning toward the stage, and Dale would be caught on film in the exact moment he realized the room was not rising for someone else, but for me. I stepped back from him, smoothing my sleeve and adjusting my collar, while he muttered something about how even basic trainees understood the importance of proper form. He still thought this was about posture, about him demonstrating superiority. One last time before the ceremony started, he had no idea that the Army had shaped me far more deeply than he ever had, that the woman standing in front of him was not the teenager he had drilled into silence, but a commander about to take responsibility for hundreds of soldiers, and as I inhaled the cool air drifting through the open doors, I told myself the truth I had learned over years of service. Sometimes silence was not submission, sometimes it was strategy. And standing there outside the hall with his grip still ghosting on my skin, I felt the strategy settling into place. He still thinks he is shaping me, but he has no idea the Army already has, and in a few minutes the entire room was going to show him exactly what that meant. The moment I stepped through the doors of the hall, the air shifted thick with ceremony and polished shoes, and the low murmur of families settling into their seats. Rows of uniforms forming neat lines beneath the hanging flags, the stage bright under the overhead lights, and even though my heart beat a little faster, I kept my walk calm and measured eyes forward, because commanders do not fidget before their own ceremonies. I slipped quietly into the back row just as the protocol officer directed, aware of the balcony camera above us, and aware, too, of Dale settling heavily into the seat beside Laura, his knee jiggling with impatience, his jaw working like he had already decided the whole event was beneath him. He leaned toward me with a smirk voice pitched low but not low enough to hide. Watch. They will bring in some full bird colonel. We will clap, you will clap like everyone else. His tone carried the same patronizing finality he had used my entire life. As if he were reminding me where he believed I belonged, I breathed slowly and kept my hands folded in my lap, because the minutes leading up to a reveal always feel longer than the reveal itself. The hall dimmed slightly as the last family sat down, a ripple of quiet moving from the front to the back, and then General Harper Shaw walked onto the stage. Every soldier in the room straightening instinctively, she took her place at the podium, the room settling into attention beneath her calm authority, and began to speak in that steady, even tone commanders use when they are about to change the direction of something important. Today we gather to welcome a new leader to the 305th Intelligence Battalion. She said, her voice carrying clearly a commander whose work has shaped the battlefield without firing a single round, whose decisions have saved lives in ways most will never see. I watched people tilt their heads slightly, listening, curious. Shaw continued, "She is the youngest lieutenant colonel to hold this post, a record earned not through luck, but through relentless service and extraordinary results. At the word she, I saw Dale shift. He made a dismissive noise in his throat, shook his head a little and muttered, 'They are getting soft.' Laura pressed her lips together but said nothing. The officers in the front row leaned forward, anticipation beginning to take shape. Then General Shaw stepped to the side of the podium, lifted her chin slightly, and said the words that would split the room cleanly in two. "Please stand for Lieutenant Colonel Riley Kincaid for a breath." The room went silent. Suspended and then in one unified motion, every soldier, every officer, every family member rose to their feet, the sound of dozens of chairs scraping back, blending with the sudden swell of applause. The entire hall turning toward the back where I sat, Dale looked around, confused at first eyes, bouncing from the stage to the rows in front of him, then following the collective gaze behind him until he was staring directly at me as I stood, smoothing the front of my uniform, his face draining of color, as realization crashed into him. The applause grew louder, officers raising their hands in sharp salutes toward me, the air thick with respect, so sudden and immense it felt like a wave rushing forward. General Shaw stepped down from the stage and walked toward me through the aisle, extending her hand as she said, "Welcome, Mom." Her voice warm and formal all at once, and as I stepped past the back row to meet her, I moved in slow motion. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because the moment demanded it. The balcony camera caught everything. Dale sitting frozen for a beat too long before scrambling gracelessly to his feet, his salute delayed and crooked whispers spreading through the rows near him as people recognized him. From outside, one soldier murmuring, "Is that her stepdad?" The one who corrected her salute? The ceremony continued around us, but that first moment never loosened its grip. The sound of hundreds standing for me. The command baton waiting on stage, the certainty that the world I lived in and the world he tried to force on me had finally collided in front of witnesses after shaking General Shaw's hand. I walked with her to the stage, the row of officers saluting again as I passed, and when I reached the front, the outgoing commander stepped aside and the battalion colors were presented, the thick fabric folding toward me, the weight of responsibility and recognition settling across my palms as I accepted the guidon reciting the oath, with a voice that did not shake behind me. Dale remained motionless small in a way he did not know men his size could be, the camera capturing him in frame after frame, while the people he believed would look down on me instead looked up once the oath ended and the hall erupted again in applause. I turned slightly, scanning the back row not to provoke or gloat, but because I needed to see it for myself. The truth of the moment laid out plainly in rows of uniforms and stunned expressions. I stepped past him on my way to the reception, and he did not meet my eyes. He stared at the floor as if it might explain how the ceremony had unfolded without his permission. For the first time in my life, I felt no urge to justify myself to him, no impulse to shrink or apologize or offer softness he had never given me. Instead, I felt something deeper, steadier. The quiet satisfaction of standing in a room where my presence spoke louder than any defense could for once. I do not have to defend myself, I thought as I walked toward the stage. Lights, the room is doing it for me. The reception room shimmered with warm lights and soft conversation clusters of officers and families gathering around tables set with coffee urns and small plates of appetizers, the kind of atmosphere where people relaxed once the formalities were over. Yet beneath that comfortable buzz, I could still feel the charged residue of the ceremony, the echo of chairs scraping as the entire room stood for me, and every few minutes a soldier or officer would approach to shake my hand or offer congratulations, their sincerity grounding me far more than the medals pinned to my chest. But across the room, I could see Dale hovering near the refreshment table. Jaw-tight posture, stiff with the effort of pretending nothing had shifted under his feet. I watched him drain half a cup of punch, as if hydrating could restore what he had lost. Then I saw him straighten his shoulders and stride toward a group of senior officers, Colonel Briggs and Command Sergeant Major Lewis among them. Men respected across the post, men who had been on their feet the moment my name was announced. Dale forced a laugh as he slipped into their circle. Voice pitched too loud with forced confidence. "I have been in longer than she has been alive," he said. I helped shape soldiers like her. He expected nods, respect, the usual approval he gathered in small circles. But instead, Briggs tilted his head slightly, as if reassessing him, and Command Sergeant Major Lewis raised an eyebrow, his tone mild, but his words cutting cleanly funny from what I heard. "You did not even know who she was today?" The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Dale's smile twitched the edges, faltering. He tried to recover with another laugh, but the moment had already slipped past him. The officers excused themselves, politely leaving him standing alone with his empty cup staring after them as if they had betrayed him by not participating in the fiction he had rehearsed. I turned away before he could see me watching because I had plans of my own, and they did not require him to notice me. I found the public affairs officer near the back of the room, reviewing footage from the ceremony on a tablet. I leaned in and said quietly that I wanted a short highlight clip made for the internal portal. Something to recognize the battalion and the transition, include the moment the room stood and the walk up the aisle, I added, and make sure the balcony camera angle is in the cut. He nodded professionally, not asking why, because officers request highlight reels all the time, and within 24 hours that video would be seen by every unit on the base, by every soldier who had not been at the ceremony but would now watch the exact instant Dale realized he had stood too late for his own stepdaughter. I did not need to embarrass him myself. The footage would do it with quiet precision. Later that week, I heard from a sergeant that some of Dale's peers had already begun joking about it, one of them saying, "Heard you got schooled by your own Lieutenant Colonel's stepdaughter." The kind of teasing that stung more, because it carried truth, small ripples of consequence he never saw coming. Consequence that matched the small humiliations he had stacked on my childhood. But the biggest part of my silent revenge unfolded days later, when he approached me after duty hours outside my office. His face arranged into a careful expression of professional courtesy, the kind men like him used when they needed something from someone they once underestimated. He cleared his throat and said he was thinking of applying for a clean admin position before retiring something with better hours, less field pressure. And could I write him a recommendation? He claimed it was just paperwork, just a formality, and for a moment, I saw the boyish hope flicker behind the lines on his face. The belief that I would be too polite, too forgiving, too trained in respect to say no. So I said yes, but the yes came with an internal decision he never anticipated. I sat at my desk later that evening and wrote a recommendation that was honest, not cruel, not exaggerated, just truthful in the way he had always assumed no one would dare articulate on record. I wrote that he demonstrated difficulty adjusting to new leadership styles, that he was resistant to organizational change, that he displayed a tendency to cling to outdated training methods, nothing personal, nothing vengeful, simply observations that officers and NCOs had quietly shared for years, the kind of details that senior boards look at closely when choosing who to move into certain positions. I signed the document with steady handwriting, uploaded it according to protocol, and knew that the selection committees reading it would not mark him as a priority candidate. Not because of who I was, but because of what he had consistently proven himself to be. And he never once suspected the source of the roadblocks he later encountered, never considered that the truth he tried so hard to bury was finally written in ink by the person he spent years diminishing sometime during the reception. I glanced across the room again and saw him standing alone near the food table, shoulders heavy-looking, smaller than I had ever seen him. He stared at the doorway as if unsure whether to leave or stay. Voices from nearby conversations drifting around him, laughter from Briggs' group bouncing through the space, none directed at him, none including him. A strange shadow of isolation settling over him that he did not know how to name, and I felt the shift inside myself, not triumph exactly, but clarity. I am not sabotaging his career. I told myself, I am just telling the truth he tried to bury. And the truth no longer frightened me because it was finally speaking for itself. A few months after the ceremony, when the battalion had settled into its rhythm and my days were filled with briefings, evaluations, and shaping a command climate I could be proud of, I began hearing murmurs in the hallway, the kind of low conversations soldiers have when they think leadership is not listening, snippets about an investigation about training hours that did not add up, about complaints from younger troops who claimed an NCO had pushed them past regulation limits or humiliated them under the guise of discipline. At first, I did not connect the dots. The Army was large and these issues surfaced everywhere. But then, Captain Monroe from JAG knocked on my office door and stepped inside, holding a thin folder, her expression neutral in that careful way military lawyers used. When choosing their words, she said, "Mom, I have a matter involving a soldier you know personally." And when she set the folder on my desk and I saw the name on the tab, my breath stilled. Master Sergeant Dale Hargrove, the page beneath outlining alleged falsification of training hours and complaints of mild hazing. Nothing criminal but serious enough to affect retirement eligibility and career reputation. I sat back as Monroe explained that the investigation was routine, but his chain of command had flagged patterns that required review. I listened quietly, nodding, keeping my hands folded because the irony was so sharp it almost hurt. She asked if I wished to recuse myself from any involvement, and I said calmly that I had no influence over his unit, and that the process should unfold the same way it would for anyone else. But I knew the news would reach him soon enough, and 2 days later it did, because late in the afternoon, my aide stepped into my office and said, "He's outside, looks shaken. Wants to see you." I swallowed. Once then nodded for her to send him in. Dale walked through the doorway, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. As if the investigation had shaved inches from his posture, he sat down heavily without waiting for my permission, wiping his palms against his pants, sweat clinging to the back of his neck. I folded my hands on the desk and waited for him to speak. He took a long breath, then said, "Riley, they are coming after me. These kids today cannot take real training. They complain about anything. You know that talk to someone you have pull now." His voice cracked slightly on the word pull, as if admitting that I now held power he needed was physically painful. He looked at me the way a man looks when his world is crumbling, and he cannot understand why no one is rushing in to hold it up for him. I let the silence stretch before I asked, very softly, "Did you ever consider talking to someone for me when I was 15, when you made me stand for 40 minutes in the living room because you said I did not respect the uniform?" His eyes flickered mouth, tightening in annoyance rather than remorse. Then he delivered a line so instinctively cruel it felt rehearsed. "You turned out fine, did you not?" I made you strong for a moment. The room tilted, not because his words wounded me, but because they confirmed what I had always known. He did not see harm when he caused it, only success when someone survived it, and now he wanted credit for both my pain and my strength. Captain Monroe stepped into the doorway, then holding updated paperwork, and Dale turned to her with the desperation of a drowning man seeing a rope he could not reach. She said the investigation was ongoing and he would have a chance to respond formally. He looked back at me, eyes wide, silently begging, hoping I would stand between him and accountability. The same way he had stood between me and comfort my entire childhood, I felt my voice steady itself into something cold but fair as I turned to Monroe and said, "Captain, I will not interfere. Let the process run." Dale jerked slightly as if the words had struck him. Disbelief flooding his features, he leaned forward, gripping the edge of my desk, and whispered, "You cannot let them do this, after everything." But I met his gaze without flinching. After everything was a phrase he could no longer use as leverage. Monroe nodded and left to finalize the documents, and Dale sat there in a stunned silence, breath shallow face blotched with anger and fear. He muttered that the Army was soft now that people twisted good training into abuse, that I should understand what he was trying to do. But I shook my head slowly and said, for once, the system is on the side of the kid in the living room, not the man with the stripes. He stared at me. Then, like he was seeing someone entirely new, someone he had never imagined would sit across from him with this rank, this authority, this absence of apology. When he finally stood, his legs trembled slightly, and for the first time he did not offer advice or correction or insults. He simply walked out, shoulders hunched, a man stripped of the illusion that dominance protected him. Weeks later, the results arrived: a formal letter of reprimand placed permanently in his file, ending any possibility of him transferring into the cushy admin role he had wanted for retirement. He called my mother devastated, insisting the board had been unfair, that someone sabotaged him. But the truth was simple and unembellished. The system had finally seen him clearly, and I had simply stepped aside long enough for that truth to land. As I sat in my office, reviewing the final documentation, sunlight slanting across my desk, I felt something I had never felt in connection with him before: a quiet release, not triumph, not revenge, just a steady, undramatic sense that justice had finally balanced its own scales. I drove back to Wilmington on a gray Saturday afternoon, the kind of washed-out coastal day where the sky felt low enough to touch, and the familiar streets made something in my chest tighten, a reminder that no matter how far my rank carried me, these roads still held pieces of the girl who once stood in a living room afraid to breathe too loudly. My mother met me at the door with a soft smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the house carrying the weight of something unspoken. The quiet before a storm that had been building for years. Dale sat in his recliner boots planted wide, as if staking territory. The television muted on a football game. He was not really watching. I could see the reprimand letter sitting folded on the kitchen counter like a wound everyone kept touching, pretending it did not hurt. We exchanged a stiff hello before Laura motioned me toward the dining table and said we should talk. And the instant we sat down, she exhaled sharply, her fingers twisting a napkin as she said, "You let them ruin your stepfather. Riley, he just wanted the best for you." Her voice cracked in the middle of best, and something in me snapped from years of trying to cushion the truth for her sake. I kept my tone steady as I said, "His best almost broke me. You just never looked closely enough." She flinched, as if struck, and before she could respond, Dale barked from the recliner that the army had gone soft, that kids these days complained about everything, that leadership meant pushing people past where they thought they could go. He glared at me and said, "They only sided with me because I outranked everyone in the room." Ungrateful kids was the phrase he kept circling back to, the same two words he had thrown at me in different forms my entire childhood, and each repetition chipped away at something brittle inside me. I stood slowly turning toward him and said, "You talk about strength, like it is something you handed out in this house, but the truth is, I learned strength by surviving you, not by learning from you." Laura whispered my name, startled, confused, trying to reconcile the version of me she saw at ceremonies with the version she kept in this house. And that was when I told her something I had never spoken aloud, something I had buried so deeply I barely recognized it as mine. I said when I was a cadet, I had my first panic attack during drill, and I could not understand why my body reacted like it was under threat. I thought I was weak, but the therapist told me it was trauma, echoing from years of being corrected until I froze. Years of being told emotion was failure. Years of standing so long in the living room that my legs shook, and when I said those words, her hand went to her mouth, her eyes filling with realization so sudden it looked like pain. She whispered, "I did not know. I did not see." And for the first time, I believed her, because denial is its own kind of blindness. But she still whispered, "He meant well." And that was when I said quietly, "He meant control, and I carried the cost." Dale stood, then anger flushing his face, insisting he had pushed me, because he saw potential, because his methods worked, because "Look at you now, Riley, you turned out fine." Those words cutting through the room like a blade with no empathy on either side. He wanted credit for my survival, but not responsibility for the damage done along the way. I felt something shift inside me, like a door closing, not slammed, just sealed with finality. I picked up my uniform cap from the counter and told my mother, "From now on, I am your daughter, Mom, not a soldier." The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. Laura reached for my arm, but I stepped back gently, not rejecting her, just setting a boundary she had never learned to see. Dale scoffed behind me, muttering that I thought I was better than the family, now that rank had gone to my head, but his words slid off me like water off armor, because I finally understood the truth. His power only existed where I allowed it to. I walked toward the front door, the weight of my cap warm in my hand, and paused for a moment in the doorway. The fading afternoon light spilling across the floorboards, Dale's silhouette behind me, solid and unmoving, like a monument to a past that would never change. I did not look back at him. I only said goodbye to my mother, gently knowing she stood at the crossroads between the version of the family she wanted to believe in and the truth she had pushed away for decades. And as I stepped outside into the cool coastal air, I felt the kind of loneliness that comes not from being abandoned, but from choosing yourself a loneliness sharp and honest and necessary. I closed the door behind me, thinking I cannot save a house that keeps rebuilding itself on the same rotten foundation. And for the first time, that truth did not break me, it freed me. I returned to Fort Liberty with a different kind of resolve after that weekend in Wilmington, a steady understanding that whatever had crumbled in my mother's house did not have to echo through the halls of the 305th Intelligence Battalion. If I had survived years under a man who used rank as a weapon, then my responsibility now was to build a place where rank was a shield. Instead, my days filled quickly with meetings and training plans and long walks through the operations floor where analysts bent over screens and junior soldiers whispered as they worked. I made it clear from the first formation that our standard would be simple and absolute. We would have zero tolerance for abuse and hazing, and we would enforce discipline without humiliation. I watched faces as I spoke, some skeptical, some relieved, some too young to know that other commands did things differently over time. Those words began to shape action. I sat with my senior NCOs, including Sergeant Dana Brooks, a woman with sharp eyes and a dry sense of humor, and told them stories in broad strokes about units where toughness was confused with cruelty. I never used Dale's name, but the shadow of men like him hung over every example. Brooks nodded slowly and said, "Mom, I can work with that." I have seen enough of the other kind, Specialist Lee. One of our newer analysts reminded me sometimes of that younger version of myself. Shoulders tense whenever someone raised a voice, always hovering at the edge of a room as if ready to bolt. One evening after most of the staff had left, I found him lingering outside my office, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He finally knocked and asked if he could speak freely. His voice low as he described an NCO in a partner unit who'd been riding him hard, forcing extra drills as punishment for small mistakes, calling him names, saying things that sounded too familiar, telling him weakness had no place in uniform. The details felt like ghosts from my past, but the difference now was that I had the authority to do something about it. I listened carefully, asked for specifics, then thanked him for trusting me, and reminded him that reporting mistreatment was not disloyalty, it was courage. The next day I pulled the NCO's record, spoke with his chain of command, and initiated a formal review. It would have been easy to let my own history turn the process into a hunt, but I refused to repeat the same pattern from the other side. We investigated thoroughly documented patterns, gave him a chance to respond. When the facts lined up, there was no need for anger, just firm corrective action. I signed a disciplinary order that removed him from direct supervision of junior soldiers and mandated remedial leadership training. As my pen moved across the paper, I pictured every kid who would not have to stand in a living room equivalent somewhere on post, wondering if their fear was their own fault. I could not rewrite my story, but I could make sure fewer stories looked like mine. That thought carried me back to my small apartment in Fayetteville each night, a quiet space with nothing on the walls yet, but a framed copy of the battalion crest, and a photograph of my commissioning. I learned to enjoy the silence there, the way the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic replaced the constant tension that had once filled family dinners one evening as I was cooking something simple. My phone rang and my mother's name lit up the screen. For a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. There was a long pause on the other end before she spoke, her voice softer and older than I remembered. I left him. She said, "I packed a bag, and I left. I should have left years ago, you were right. The admission hung between us." I leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of decades in those few sentences. Part of me wanted to say, "I told you so," to list every moment when I had begged her to see what was happening. But the words stayed where they belonged, unsaid. Instead, I asked where she was. If she was safe, she told me she was staying with a friend from the hospital. For now that she had met with a counselor who told her it was never too late to stop living inside someone else's anger, I closed my eyes, picturing her folding clothes into a suitcase, walking past Dale in the recliner, without explaining the bewildered rage that must have twisted his face when he realized control was slipping through his fingers. He had lost the career he wanted, and now the wife who had buffered him from his own reflection. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a deep, tired sadness for the years we had all lost, but beneath that sadness was a thin, bright line of peace. My mother was free, and she had chosen that freedom herself. After we hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table and looked at the stack of paperwork I had brought home. Among it was a copy of the disciplinary action I had signed for that other NCO, the ink already dry. I thought I could not fix the man who broke us, but I can stop men like him from breaking others. And in that moment, all the pain and all the work and every hard choice I had made began to align into something that felt like purpose, instead of just survival. I thought about my soldiers, about Dana watching over the new sergeants, and Lee finally laughing a little easier. And I realized this battalion, imperfect as it was, had become the first real family I chose, and then protected for myself at last. The sun was dropping behind the long parade field at Fort Liberty when I finally allowed myself to stop moving and simply stand still. The air held that warm amber glow that settles over the base at the end of a training day, and in the distance, a group of junior soldiers practiced their salutes, their movements sharp but still uncertain as their sergeant corrected wrist angles and elbow heights, with a voice firm enough to guide but calm enough to steady nerves instead of shatter them. I watched them quietly and felt something loosen in my chest, because those small details, the angle of a hand, the steadiness of a chin, had once been weapons used against me. In a living room full of football noise and swallowed fear, yet here they were being taught with patience by leaders who understood the difference between discipline and domination. I let my gaze drift to my own hand, remembering the way Dale had crushed my wrist in front of that building earlier that year, and for a moment I saw the scene overlaid on the present, like two frames caught between blinks, the frightened teenager holding a salute too long and too rigid, the grown woman walking down an aisle while a room rose to its feet, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it through years of invisible work that no one in her old house ever bothered to see. I flexed my fingers slowly, feeling the quiet strength there, the kind that signs disciplinary orders that protect young soldiers from the harm I once thought was normal. The kind that rests on the shoulder of a nervous private and says, "Breathe, you are going to be all right." The kind that builds instead of breaks. The flag above me shifted in the breeze, its fabric whispering as it unfurled and caught the last gold edge of daylight. And I imagined for a moment what Dale might be doing now, maybe pacing through a house that no longer had my mother's laughter in it. Maybe replaying that ceremony on some internal loop, trying to understand how the girl he dismissed had become a commander with more authority in one signature than he held in 30 years of shouting. I felt no triumph in that thought, only a quiet acceptance that life had finally drawn its own clean line between us. I had spent so many years believing that pain was the price of belonging, and that endurance was the closest thing to strength I could hope for. But now I understood that real strength is choosing a different way, even when the old one held you by the throat. The soldiers on the field finished their drill, and one of them glanced my way, recognizing me, then straightening up with a quick nod that was more gratitude than protocol, and I nodded back, letting the moment sit between us, a simple acknowledgement that we were shaping something better together, one small correction at a time. The sky softened into deep purple as I stood there thinking of everything that had led me here. The childhood commands, the years of doubt, the unexpected rise through ranks, the day a room full of uniforms stood for me and forced the man who belittled me to witness the truth he had tried so hard to bury. He thought fixing my salute would fix my place in this world, and for a long time I believed him. But the world had a different place in mind for both of us, it turns out. A place where the kid who once froze under barking commands became the officer who refuses to let fear be confused for respect. A place where silence no longer means surrender. A place where healing looks like a battalion that trusts its leader, and a mother who finally chose safety over habit. I breathed in the cooling air, savoring the rare weightlessness that comes when a long battle has finally tilted toward peace. And as I walked back toward headquarters, I thought of all the people out there carrying old scars from family or bosses or authority figures who hid behind their rank or their title and tried to convince them they were small. So if you have ever been told you are not enough by someone who thought power gave them the right to shrink, you share your story in the comments because you do not know who might feel less alone because you finally spoke.